The Catholic Men's Podcast, helping you find good works of literature for the Catholic gentleman. Reading Mossad, The Greatest Missions of the Israeli Secret Service, by Michael Bar-Zohar and Nissim Mishal. On November 12, 2011, a tremendous explosion destroyed a secret missile base close to Tehran, killing 17 Revolutionary Guards and reducing dozens of missiles to a heap of charred iron. General Hassan Moghadam, the father of the Shabam long-range missiles and the man in charge of Iran's missile program, was killed in the explosion. But the secret target of the bombing was not Moghadam. It was a solid-fuel rocket engine able to carry a nuclear missile more than 6,000 miles across the globe from Iran's underground silos to the U.S. mainland. The new missile planned by Iran's leaders was to bring America's major cities to their knees and transform Iran into a dominant world power. The November explosion delayed the project by several months. Even though the target of the new long-range missile was America, the explosions that destroyed the Iranian base were probably set by the Israeli Secret Service, the Mossad. Since its inception more than 60 years ago, the Mossad has served fearlessly and secretly against the dangers threatening Israel and the West. And more so than ever before, the Mossad's intelligence gathering and operations affect American security abroad and at home. Right now, according to foreign sources, the Mossad is challenging the blunt, explicit promise of the Iranian leadership to obliterate Israel from the map, waging a stubborn shadow war against Iran by sabotaging nuclear facilities, assassinating scientists, supplying plants with faulty equipment and raw materials via bogus companies, organizing desertions of high-ranking military officers and major figures in nuclear research, introducing ferocious viruses into Iran's computer systems. The Mossad allegedly is fighting the threat of a nuclear-armed Iran and what that would mean for the United States and the rest of the world. While the Mossad has delayed the Iranian nuclear bomb by several years, their covert battle is reaching its peak before last-resort measures, military strikes, are employed. In the fight against terrorism, the Mossad has been capturing and eliminating sources of major terrorists in their strongholds in Beirut, Damascus, Baghdad, and Tunis, and in their battle stations in Paris, Rome, Athens, and Cyprus since the 1970s. On February 12, 2008, according to the Western media, Mossad agents ambushed and killed Imad Mughnaya, the military leader of the Hezbollah in Damascus. Mughnaya was a sworn enemy of Israel, but he was also number one on the FBI's most wanted list. He had planned and executed the massacre of 241 U.S. Marines in Beirut. He had left behind a bloody trail strewn with hundreds of Americans, Israelis, French, and Argentinians. Right now, Islamic Jihad and al-Qaeda leaders are being hunted throughout the Middle East. And yet, when the Mossad warned the West that the Arab Spring could turn into an Arab winter, no one seemed to listen. This Arab winter has turned the Middle East into a time bomb, threatening the Israeli people and its allies in the Western world. As history unfolds, the Mossad's tasks will become riskier, but also more vital to the West. The Mossad appears to be the best defense against the Iranian nuclear threat, against terrorism, against whatever may evolve from the mayhem in the Middle East. Most important, the Mossad is the last salvo short of open war. The unnamed warriors of the Mossad are its lifeblood, men and women who risk their lives, live away from their families under assumed identities, carry out daring operations in enemy countries where the slightest mistake can bring their arrest, torture, or death. During the Cold War, the worst fate for a secret agent captured in the West or the Communist bloc was to be exchanged for another agent on some cold, foggy bridge in Berlin. Russian or American, British or East German, the agent always knew he was not alone. There was always someone who would bring him back from the cold. But for the lonely warriors of the Mossad, there are no exchanges and foggy bridges. They pay with their lives for their audacity. In this book, we bring to light the greatest missions and the most courageous heroes of the Mossad, as well as the mistakes and failures that more than once tarnished the agency's image and shook its very foundations. These missions shaped Israel's fate, and in many ways the fate of the world. And yet, for the Mossad's agents, what they all share is a deep, idealistic love of their country, a total devotion to its existence and survival, a readiness to assume the most dramatic risks and face the ultimate dangers for the sake of Israel. So that's the introduction to Mossad, and after reading the entire book, I was shocked at how the Israeli Secret Service has repeatedly helped America and the West in general, whether it's fighting communism during the Cold War or neutralizing jihadist nuclear threats, and I had never heard about it. So that's why I wanted to do a podcast on it. That, and partly because the stories in this book are absolutely riveting. Now, I can't condone everything that the Mossad does in this book, or even everything that the Israelis do, so please don't take this podcast as a blanket approval. And by the way, if you're a young reader, this book needs to be heavily edited. Nevertheless, if you read this book, you can't deny that the jihadis and communists are repeatedly outsmarted by the Israelis, and from that perspective, it's awesome. Story 1. King of Shadows. In the summer of 1971, a fierce storm was lashing the Mediterranean coast, and tall waves battered the shores of Gaza. The local Arab fishermen prudently stayed ashore. This was not a day to brave the treacherous sea. They watched with astonishment as a ramshackle boat suddenly emerged from the roaring waves and landed heavily on the wet sand. A few Palestinians, their clothes and keffiyehs rumpled and soaked, jumped out and waded ashore. Their unshaven faces showed the fatigue of a long journey at sea, but they had no time to rest. They were running for their lives. From the angry seas, an Israeli torpedo boat emerged, pursuing them at full speed, carrying soldiers in full battle attire. As it approached the shore, the soldiers jumped into the shallow waters and opened fire on the fleeing Palestinians. A couple of Gazan youngsters playing on the beach ran toward the Palestinians and led them to the safety of a nearby orchard. The Israeli soldiers lost track of them, but continued to search the beach. Late that night, a young Palestinian man carrying a Kalashnikov snuck into the orchard to investigate. He found the fugitives huddled together in a remote corner. "Who are you, brothers?" he asked. "Members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine," came the answer, "from the Tyre refugee camp in Lebanon." "Marhaba, welcome," the youth said. "You know of Abu Saif, our commander? He sent us to meet with the Popular Front commanders in Beth Lahia, a terrorist stronghold in the south of the Gaza Strip. We have money and weapons, and we want to coordinate our operations." "I'll help you with that," the young man said. The following morning, several armed terrorists escorted the newcomers into an isolated house inside the Jabalia refugee camp. They were led into a large room and invited to sit at a table. Soon after, the Popular Front commanders they hoped to meet walked in. They exchanged warm greetings with their Lebanese brothers and sat facing them. "Can we start?" asked a stocky, balding young man wearing a red keffiyeh, apparently the leader of the Lebanese group. "Is everybody here?" "Everybody." The Lebanese raised his hand and looked at his watch. It was a prearranged signal. Suddenly, the Lebanese envoys drew their handguns and opened fire. In less than a minute, the Beth Lahia terrorists were dead. The Lebanese ran out of the house, made their ways through the crooked alleys of the Jabalia camp and Gaza's crowded streets, and soon crossed into Israeli territory. That evening, the man with the red keffiyeh, Captain Meir Dagan, commander of the Israeli Defense Forces, reported to General Ariel Arik Sharon that Operation Chameleon had been a success. All the leaders of the Popular Front in Beth Lahia, a lethal terrorist group, had been killed. Dagan was only 26, but already a legendary fighter. He had planned the entire operation, posing as Lebanese terrorists, sailing in on an old vessel from Ashdod, a port in Israel, the long night of hiding, the meeting with the terrorist leaders, and the escape route after the hit. He had even organized the fake pursuit by the Israeli torpedo boat. Dagan was the ultimate guerrilla, bold and creative, not someone who stuck to the rules of engagement. Yitzhak Rabin once said, "Meir has the unique capacity to invent anti-terrorist operations that look like movie thrillers." And this operation was no different. Story 2. Oh, that's Khrushchev's speech. Viktor Grajewski was a senior editor at the Polish news agency in charge of Soviet and Eastern European affairs. He was actually Jewish, and his real name was Viktor Spielman. But years ago, when he had joined the Communist Party, his friends had let him know that with a name like Spielman, he wouldn't get far. So he changed it to Grajewski, which sounded Polish. When the German army invaded Poland in World War II, he was a child. His family had managed to cross into Russia and narrowly escaped the Holocaust. After the war, they came back to Poland. In 1949, Viktor's parents and younger sister immigrated to Israel, but he, a staunch and ardent communist, stayed behind. Stalin's admirer, he longed to help create a workers' paradise. But neither his friends and colleagues nor even his beloved knew what disenchantment had started gnawing at the young communist's heart. In 1955, he visited his family in Israel and saw another world, free, progressive, a Jewish democratic nation, a dream of sorts, utterly different from the communist propaganda he had been exposed to. Back in Poland, 33-year-old Viktor began to consider immigrating to Israel. That morning, in April 1956, Viktor came, as usual, to visit his sweetheart at the party's secretary office. Her name was Lucia Baranowski, and she worked as a secretary to Edward Okab, Secretary General of the Polish Communist Party. The members of his staff had grown accustomed to charming Viktor's frequent visits to his lovely girlfriend. There were no secrets about Lucia's feelings for this dashing young man. On a corner of her desk, he saw a brochure bound in a red cover, numbered and stamped with the inscription, "Top Secret." "What's this?" he asked her. "Oh, that? Just Khrushchev's speech," she answered casually. Viktor froze. He had heard about Khrushchev's speech, but had never met anybody who had heard or read a single sentence from it. It was one of the best-kept secrets of the communist bloc. Viktor did know that Nikita Khrushchev, the almighty Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party, had delivered the speech at the party's 20th Congress that had taken place the previous February at the Kremlin. On February 25th, shortly before midnight, all foreign guests and heads of foreign communist parties were asked to leave the hall. At midnight, Khrushchev took the podium and spoke to the 1,400 Soviet delegates. His speech was said to be a surprise and a terrible shock for everyone present. But what had he said? According to an American journalist who dispatched a first report to the West, the speech had lasted for 4 hours, and Khrushchev had described in detail the terrible crimes of the man worshipped by millions of communists all over the world, Stalin. Khrushchev, rumor had it, had accused Stalin of the massacre of millions. Some whispered that while listening to the speech, many delegates cried and pulled out their hair in despair. Some fainted or suffered heart attacks. At least 2 committed suicide after that night. But not a word about Khrushchev's revelations was published by the Soviet media. Rumors wafted about Moscow, and some passages of the speech were read in closed sessions of the party's supreme bodies. But the full text of the speech was guarded, as if it were a state secret. Foreign reporters had told Viktor that the Western secret services were mounting an all-out effort to obtain the text. The CIA had offered $1 million in reward. It was estimated that the publication of the text at the height of the Cold War between the West and the Soviet bloc could generate a political earthquake in the communist countries and trigger an unprecedented crisis. Hundreds of millions of communists inside and outside Russia blindly worshipped Stalin. The exposure of his crimes could destroy their faith and perhaps even cause the collapse of the Soviet Union. But all the efforts to get the speech failed. It remained an enigma. Lately, Viktor had learned that Khrushchev had decided to send a few numbered copies to Communist Party leaders in Eastern Europe, which was how that brochure, bound in red, had reached Lucia's desk. When Viktor Grajewski spotted it, he had a crazy idea. He asked Lucia to lend it to him for a couple of hours so he could read it at home, without all the hustle and bustle in this office. To his surprise, she agreed. She was happy to please him. "You can take it," she said, "but you must bring it back before 4 p.m. I have to lock it in the safe." At home, Viktor read the speech. It was indeed stunning. Khrushchev had shattered boldly and mercilessly the myth of Joseph Stalin. Khrushchev had revealed that Stalin, during his years in power, had committed monstrous crimes and ordered the murder of millions. He'd reminded his audience that Lenin, the father of the Bolshevik Revolution, had warned the party against Stalin. Khrushchev condemned the cult of personality of the man who'd been hailed as the son of the nations. He told of the forced relocation of entire ethnic groups in the Soviet Union, which led to countless deaths, of the Great Purges, 1936 to 1937, when 1.5 million communists were arrested and 680,000 of them executed. Khrushchev also spoke of the doctors' plot, the fabricated accusations against some Jewish doctors who allegedly had conspired to murder Stalin and other Soviet leaders. Khrushchev's words revealed Stalin as a mass murderer who had massacred millions of Russians and other nationals, many of them loyal communists. In 4 hours, the Messiah had metamorphosed into a monster. Khrushchev's speech shredded Victor's last illusions about communism, and he realized that he held in his hands an explosive device that could shake the Soviet camp to its foundations. He decided to return the red brochure to Lucia, but on his way to her, he had second thoughts, and his feet carried him elsewhere, to the Israeli embassy. He walked in confidently, and the wall of Polish policemen and Secret Service agents parted and let him pass. A few minutes later, he was in the office of Yakov Barmor, officially a first secretary of the embassy, but in reality, the Shabak representative in Poland. Krajewski handed him the red brochure. The Israeli perused it, and his jaw dropped. "Will you wait a few minutes?" he asked, grabbed the brochure, and left the room. He came back an hour later. Krajewski realized that Barmor had photocopied it, but asked no questions. He picked it up, concealed it under his coat, and left. He reached Lucia's office in time, and he put it in the safe. Nobody bothered him or asked him about his impromptu visit to the Israeli embassy. On Friday, April 13, 1956, in the early afternoon, Zelig Katz entered the office of the director of Shabak, Amos Manor. Katz was Manor's personal assistant. Shabak headquarters were located in an old Arab building in Jaffa, not far from the picturesque flea market. Manor asked Katz the routine Friday question, "Any material from Eastern Europe?" Zelig nonchalantly quipped that a few minutes ago he had received from Warsaw some speech of Khrushchev at the Congress. Manor jumped up from his seat. "What?" he roared. "Bring it at once!" Manor, a tall, handsome young man, had immigrated to Israel only a few years earlier. Born Arthur Mindelovich in Romania, to a well-to-do family, he was sent to Auschwitz, where his entire family, parents, sister, and 2 brothers, were murdered. He survived, weighing barely 80 pounds when the camp was liberated. Back in Bucharest, he worked for Aliyah Beth, helping smuggle Jewish refugees into British-controlled Palestine. He used the name of Amos and several other names to cover his tracks. When his turn came to leave for Israel in 1949, the Romanian authorities wouldn't let him go. He managed to escape with a forged Czech passport in the name of Otto Stanek. His friends started calling him the man with 1,000 names. In Israel, he became Amos Manor. He rose quickly in the secret services. Isser, the head of the Mossad, was fascinated by him. He recruited Amos to the Shabak in 1949. Barely 4 years later, he was appointed director by Ben-Gurion on Isser's recommendation. He also was put in charge of the Israeli intelligence community's secret relations with the CIA. On that rainy Friday, Manor threw himself into the sheaf of photocopied papers. He had no problems reading it. One of his 7 languages was Russian. Reading the pages, he realized the huge importance of Khrushchev's speech. He jumped into his car and rushed to Ben-Gurion's house. "You must read this," he told the prime minister. Ben-Gurion, who also knew Russian, read the speech. The following morning, a Sabbath, he summoned Manor urgently. "This is a historic document," he said, "and it all but proves that in the future, Russia will become a democratic nation." Isser got the speech on April 15th and right away saw it could be a bonanza for Israel. In it was the means to upgrade the Mossad's ties with the CIA, first established in 1947. In 1951, when visiting the United States, Ben-Gurion had called on General Walter Bedell-Smith, whom he had met in Europe at the end of World War II. Bedell-Smith was the director of the CIA, and he agreed, hesitantly, to establish limited cooperation between the CIA and the Mossad. The main element of such cooperation was the debriefing by the Israelis of Soviet and Eastern Bloc immigrants. Many were engineers, technicians, and even army officers who had worked in Soviet installations and were able to supply detailed information about the capacities of the Communist bloc's armies. This information was regularly conveyed, and it very much impressed the Americans. But this time, Isser and Amos offered far more than immigrants' debriefings. They decided to hand over Khrushchev's speech to the Americans, not via the CIA man in Tel Aviv, but directly in Washington. On April 17th, it was on President Eisenhower's desk. The American intelligence experts were stunned. Israel's tiny spy services had obtained what the giant, sophisticated services of the United States, Britain, and France couldn't get. Skeptical, CIA senior staff had the document examined by experts, who unanimously concluded it was genuine. Based on that, the CIA leaked it to the New York Times, which published it on its front page on June 1956. Its publication caused an earthquake of sorts in the communist world and prompted millions to turn their backs on the Soviet Union. Some historians hold that the spontaneous uprisings against the Soviets in Poland and Hungary in the fall of 1956 were motivated by Khrushchev's revelations. The intelligence coup led to a major breakthrough in the Mossad's relations with its American counterpart, and the modest brochure that Sweet Lucia had shown to her handsome Victor had surrounded the Israeli Mossad with a legendary aura. Back in Warsaw, no one suspected Viktor Grayevsky of having smuggled Khrushchev's speech to the United States. In January 1957, Victor immigrated to Israel. Grateful Amos Manor helped him get a job in the East European Department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Shortly afterward, he was also hired as an editor and reporter in the Polish section of Kol Israel, the state-owned radio network. But soon he also got another job. Shortly after coming to Israel, he'd met a few Soviet diplomats at an Ulpan, a special school where immigrants and foreigners were taught the Hebrew language. One of the Russian diplomats happened to meet him in a foreign ministry's hallway and was impressed by the important position held by this new immigrant. Soon afterward, a KGB agent popped up by chance at Grayevsky's side on a Tel Aviv street. He conversed with Grayevsky and reminded him of his past in Poland as an anti-Nazi and a communist. Then he made him an offer: become a KGB agent in Israel. Grayevsky promised to think about it, then made a beeline from Mossad headquarters. "What should I do?" he asked. The Mossad people were delighted. "Wonderful," they said. "Go ahead and accept." They would turn Grayevsky into a double agent who would feed the Russians false information. So began a new and long career for Victor. For many years, he supplied the Russians with information concocted and doctored by the Mossad. His KGB handlers would meet him clandestinely in different places, like forests or crowded restaurants. Not once in the 14 years that Grayevsky spent as a double agent did the Soviets suspect that he was the one using them. They complimented him over and over for the excellent materials that he provided. In KGB headquarters in Moscow, rumor had it that the Soviet Union had an agent embedded deep in Israeli governing circles. Through all those years, the Soviets trusted Grayevsky and never questioned his credibility. However, in 1967, the long-lasting affair between Grayevsky and the KGB reached its peak. He was summoned to a meeting with his Soviet handler in a forest in central Israel. The KGB agent solemnly informed him that the Soviet government wanted to thank him for his devoted services and had decided to award him its highest distinction, the Lenin Medal. The Russian apologized for not being able to pin the medal on Grayevsky's lapel in Israel, but assured him that the medal was being kept for him in Moscow and he would receive it whenever he got there. Grayevsky preferred to stay in Israel, and in 1971 he retired from the spy game. Later, he died at the age of 81, and somewhere in the Kremlin, in a little box padded with red velvet, his medal, engraved with the profile of Vladimir Lenin, perhaps still awaits him. I don't know if you can get better spy operations than the ones you'll find in this book, and there's many more where they came from. Like the time they steal a new MiG fighter jet right from under the Russians' noses. So get ready for more. Thanks so much for listening, and Godspeed.